Hi, you clearly all have an interest in anthropology because we saw that you applied to anthropology at Queen's. So we would like to talk a little bit here about the situation we're all in, so the current pandemic, and how anthropology and some of the staff members in our school have been thinking about the pandemic and what we can do as anthropologists to contribute to understanding what the pandemic does to human society. So maybe to start in my own case, my focus on the pandemic stems from research topics that I've worked on in the past. So as a migrant, I was born in Holland. So as a migrant in Northern Ireland, but also as the daughter of a refugee, I'm really fascinated by the ways in which members of transnational families stay in touch across distance. So, of course, people use over different historical periods also different technologies. So it started with letters, and then, of course, today emails, Facebook, WhatsApp, Skype, and so on. So how can we create sociality and a sense of family across distance? And maybe how do we fail to do so? Another question I find really interesting is how do we negotiate care relationships? So care for other people, maybe other generations within one family. Now, when the pandemic started and all people in lockdown, and perhaps also yourself, were suddenly confronted with the fact that we have family members that we cannot reach. So maybe even your grandmother lives next door, but you're not allowed to see her face to face. So how do we then get in touch with people? And you might think that migrant families are already some kind of specialists in this because they have they're confronted with this day to day. So when the pandemic happened, I thought, why not do some research into this? So I interviewed 10 migrant women who are all based in Belfast, who have family in Poland, Bulgaria, the Netherlands, and the US. And I just asked them to reflect on the ways in which their life had changed. And yeah, also the ways in which certain things continued as they were before. So I found that the ways in which they used different communication technologies was either a continuation of what they'd done in the past. So, for example, one family, they had every Sunday a meeting with the parents, the elderly parents. So almost like having a roast dinner. So it's a ritual kind of repetitive engagement where you can talk and chat and maybe exchange ideas. So continuation was one. Intensification, definitely, because people were worried, you know, how does my family cope in my homeland and so on. But also, interestingly, innovations. So people who started using Skype in new ways, maybe family members who suddenly together, like over 3 generations, playing a game on the internet and so on. But also there was some distancing. So, of course, we have to undermine the myth that the internet connects us all and all families are happy, because that's not the case. There's always tensions in families. And I found that some of the migrants that I interviewed felt that in the beginning of the pandemic, there was more intense communication. But then they did notice that maybe they did not share certain interests, or they did not really like that nephew, or and so on. So they felt, well, actually, there is still emotional distance that I had before might even be highlighted because I'm not going to talk to him, but I'm going to talk with my other nephew. So that's basically what I've been looking at. Of course, it's work in progress, but the nice thing about anthropology is that you can do research on other people, but also it reflects on your own life. So let me hand over to Dom. So you have any similar experiences, or what is your take on?
I mean, it's extraordinary the impact that this this pandemic has had. I mean, I've spoken. I've got a brother and sister in Australia, and I've spoken to them more in the last 2 months than probably the previous 4 or 5 years put together. We've been doing something every Monday as a family. And so as a family spread around the world, I've been more networked in the last 2 or 3 months than I have been in that time before. And I don't know how this will play out in the long run, but it seems to me so interesting how these changes have taken place. My own work, I look at peace and conflict in Northern Ireland. So I look at the history of the conflict in Northern Ireland, and I particularly look at how groups, voluntary groups, community groups work across the divide in Northern Ireland, between groups that consider themselves to be Protestant and Catholic, and how they try and bring people together to try and create a more peaceful society. And we've had 20 years of peace agreement here. And what was so interesting is how many of these groups immediately sprung into action when this pandemic started. Enormous numbers started working together to try and assist people who needed help, to try and network with government agencies to get food parcels out, to try and deal with older people who needed prescriptions. And it was very striking how the expertise that had built up in Belfast through that peace process immediately came into action when we had the lockdown. And we have a number of students who are already doing research on it. So I'm looking at how community groups have worked during this period.
Thank you. So, Dr. Fiona Murphy, can you tell us your point of view here?
Yeah, well, actually, my work for a very long number of years has been on displacement, particularly focusing on asylum seekers and refugees on the island of Ireland, in France and in Turkey, and looking at their sort of different experiences in all of these different places. So I suppose it's interesting on a number of levels to kind of consider the impact of the pandemic on displaced individuals and families, particularly from our own holding spaces, our own somewhat privileged holding spaces, during the pandemic. And I suppose one of the big sort of political and challenging issues in the Republic of Ireland is where there is a system of detainment, for want of a better description, called direct provision, is the way in which COVID has spread in those centres, and the continued reluctance of the Irish government really to deal with that issue. So I think that the level at which asylum seekers and refugees have been impacted has been pretty profound in the Republic, and also in other contexts. One of my other projects is in Turkey, and in Turkey we work with Syrian refugees, and again, because Syrian refugees in Turkey work in the informal economy, are regularly sort of underemployed and exploited, and work in sectors such as cleaning and particularly the textile industry. They've been sort of profoundly impacted in terms of simply no longer being able to earn a living, not being able to pay rents, and there's been very little government assistance. So what you have happening in Syria, or in Turkey, is I suppose NGOs trying in a very piecemeal fashion at the moment to engage, but it's been very, very challenging. As well, in cities like Istanbul, there's been a huge increase in hostility, even worse than it was before the pandemic, towards Syrians. So these are all the sort of struggles that Syrians in Istanbul are living with. So I suppose going forward in terms of an anthropological perspective, I suppose the hope is very much to sort of continue some research in the area and try and think a little bit around how I suppose this level of uncertainty in terms of what we were finding even before the pandemic can be remedied in engagement with NGOs and the development sector. So that's one of the hopes for some of what I'm working on in that context.
Clearly, yeah, that's very important research, of course. So Yannis, we're moving on now to Dr. Yannis Tsoulakis. Do you have any
thanks very much, Mariska. I think my research connects nicely to what Fiona was saying, because it also deals with ideas of insecurity, ideas of what we call precarity, the idea of insecurity connected to employment, underemployment, unemployment, and so on. But mine is more from a musical perspective. So I'm an ethnomusicologist, which is an anthropologist who looks at music cultures. And my research over the past few years has been on professional musicians in Greece and how they understand what they do, their creative practice as work, as labor, what kind of working conditions they find, how they strategize to find work, and specifically in the past few years, how they deal with circumstances of economic crisis. The economic crisis in Greece is quite an infamous kind of case study politically, sociologically, economically, anthropologically, and so on. And I've been looking at this from the musical perspective of how musicians make a living within conditions of austerity, crisis, and again, what we call precarity, this kind of precariousness of not being able to find enough work to support yourself. Now, as you can imagine, COVID-19 as an emergency really impacts this in very, very profound ways. So especially with music venues that are being closed, musicians find it a lot harder to find employment. They're kind of seeking ways of collecting benefits and so on and supporting themselves until such time as there is kind of a return to normalcy, which no one knows whenever that's going to be. What is specifically interesting also for me is that a lot of people, obviously, and you might have seen that yourselves, during the crisis and because of isolation, the lockdown, have been consuming a lot more music. They've been listening to a lot more music. They've been participating in kind of live concerts and things like that, watching things on their computer, mainly for free. A lot of people might be now listening to more music that they would have in the past, which is interesting because musicians tend not to get any income from this. Okay, so what is interesting for me is how do musicians cope with this? If music is becoming this kind of good that is meant to help a lot with kind of the experience of COVID-19, how does that impact on musicians who produce that music? You know, how does that impact on their lives? So this is kind of the scope that I'm coming to this subject.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's clear from what I've heard that anthropology clearly is interested in the pandemic and because of its view from below. So the fact that we actually talk to people and create relations based on trust and often long-term relations where we hang out with people. And maybe this day and age we hang out through Zoom, but nevertheless, you know, you become friends with your research participants, which gives you a great view from the personal perspective, as well as thinking about trends among different groups who might be affected by COVID-19 in different ways, but then always also bearing in mind the individual perspective, as well as the larger political and economic kind of conditions. So yeah, we hope you will join us in anthropology in September. We are very ready for you. As you can see, we're trying to cope with this Zoom environment, but of course, hopefully we'll be teaching you face to face as well. So yeah, hopefully see you soon.
Look forward to seeing everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.